Welcome to Deshsanchar. Today we have two of our esteemed guests, Tony Barnstone and Ravi Shankar. Tony Barnstone is a professor of English at Whitetier College and the author of 21 books and a music CD as well. He's a prolific poet, author, essayist, and a literary translator. In addition to his numerous published books, his work has appeared in dozens of American literary journals, from APR to poetry. Likewise, Ravi Shankar is a poet, scholar, and educator whose work spans continents and disciplines, a senior lecturer at Tufts University who holds an MFA from Columbia and a PhD from University of Sydney. He has taught at institutions across US, Asia, and Europe and led immerse writing workshops from Kathmandu to Athens. His scholarship probes race, punishment, and narrative, making one of the contemporary American letters most globally minded voices. So we would like to welcome both of you to Deshsanchar.
It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So now I'd like to start with a very generic question. So what is the role of a poetry in society? And do you feel the role has changed over the course of your career or the time span? I'd like to start with Ravi Shankar.
Yes, absolutely. Well, poetry is, one of the most ancient verse forms, predates written codified language, actually. So oral histories could be transmitted. And so the music of poetry is primal, and I think it's in our very bloodstream. However, I think it's fair to say that over the last century, poetry kind of waned a little bit in popularity, especially with the advent of all of the competing kinds of media. The wonderful thing is, I think we're in a moment of revival at the moment. I think poetry is, again, finding its audience. There's something about its succinctness, the lyricism that just cuts to the heart of the matter. It's music. It's perfect for an era, social media. You can post it. You can pass it. And it speaks, I think it transcends borders. It's a certain timeless, universal quality that poetry has that makes it really compelling in our time.
Yeah, please.
In different cultures, the West and the East, poetry has often been the royal road to power, but also to love. So in Heian, Japan, for example, if a man wanted to seduce a woman or a woman wanted to seduce a man, they would send a poem written in beautiful calligraphy and with on beautiful parchment, tied with a bow and maybe a sprig of some flower, and sent with a manservant to be delivered. And if everything was perfect, then you might be able to find love. And Confucius, part of what Confucius thought was that if your government wants to be in touch with the people so the government survives, you need to know what the people are thinking. And so he said, listen to the folk and listen to folk songs. So for thousands of years, in order to advance in the imperial system and to become a governor or a prefect or a mayor, you had to memorize the book of songs. Now, in the West, of course, it's been this as well, but I really think that in the West, it's more tied into the musical tradition and the oral tradition and the way of passing things down. What has happened is that because of the rise of the academy, the rise of universities, we've been cut off from the sound of poetry and the music of poetry, and it becomes something to be read on the page, read silently to yourself in your room. But if you think about, for example, how the ghazal works in India and Pakistan and across the Middle East, the ghazal, it's on the page, but it really comes alive in music. It really comes alive when people are having a competition, and I'll give you one verse and you give me one verse, right? And so I think what's happened, to cut this short, is that in part because of the influence of important African American poets like Langston Hughes, we've reconnected to the musical roots of poetry, and then because of the people he's influenced, that developed into rap and hip hop, and eventually into spoken word poetry. So we are academic poets. We teach in the academy, but I think both of us would say that we're deeply connected to the idea that the poetry should go into the coffee shop as much as into the classroom, and there's a lot of life in the coffee shop in poetry in America.
Okay, so I would like to ask you that will I be mistaken if I say that poem is in the center of your career in both academic side or also the creative side? Will I be mistaken?
You would not be mistaken. I mean, I try to write everything. And there's a book of short stories by Isaac Babel, and it's titled "You Must Know Everything." And I have taken that as my credo. I take it as you must write everything. Right now I'm trying to write essays and stories. I've made the libretto for an opera. I've done the music for a blues album. I've done a new book of literary criticism that's coming out. But through all of it, the base is poetry.
Okay, so how did you first discover the poetry? I'll also come back to Ravi Shankar, but I'll start with Tony.
In a way, I had no choice. I come from a family of artists and writers and architects. My father is a writer, a poet.
I'll also ask that question. I have that.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Who's published about 80 books. I think he started in the womb. But the short answer to your question is that my house was designed by my uncle, who's an architect, who had paintings on the walls by my mother, who's an artist, and all the walls were also covered by the books of my father, so which I read all through my childhood. So I can really say I was raised inside the minds of my mother and father.
Okay, so now I'll come to you, Ravi Shankar. So how did you first discover the poetry, and what drew you to make poetry the center of your both creative and academic career, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah. I'll have to say my journey quite different than Tony's. You know, I was raised, my parents immigrated to the United States, and my father came in the late 1960s. There was these Asian exclusion acts, and they weren't allowed to come in. He was part of that first wave. As a mechanical engineer, he went to study at Howard University, and so though I was born in the U.S., I've lived in India, and I was definitely not raised to be a poet. In fact, anything but. My father wanted me to study science, engineering, math, and unfortunately I was pretty good at all of those subjects. So there was this presumption, and in fact I started university as an engineering student. But I knew, and it was probably those very first books that I read. My mother read me a lot of stories, The Phantom Toll Booth and Alice in Wonderland, and I loved writing. And I knew from that young age of 5 or 6 that I wanted to be a writer of some kind. Poetry in specific, you know, growing up in Virginia, my family still wanted to have a kind of Tamilian Brahmin life there. We used to go to Hindu temples, and all the puja, the liturgies in Sanskrit, which is a beautiful language that as a child I still don't know it as well as I should, but it was a language I didn't understand at all, and yet I found myself deeply moved. And that experience of having an emotional reaction to a language that you didn't quite understand seems to me in some way the gateway into poetry for me. And so, you know, when I was in high school at the Science and Tech High School, I took a class with Dr. Jacobs. I think there are certain teachers also on your way, and she introduced us to the confessional poets, to Sylvia Plath, Robert Lowell, and I found myself very drawn to that. And so as soon as I could shuck off that engineering, I started studying literature, and then I went to grad school, and I decided I'm just going to try to push this as long as I can and see if I can make it work.
What sort of writers or poet actually kind of influenced you? You just mentioned about the Alice in the Wonderland, because I can also connect with that book, because my father used to bring some of the those classic books, and I used to read them from the Anna Sewell and all this Black Beauties and Alice in Wonderlands. So who are the poets and the writers you have been influenced with the most during your early days, and how do you see the presence, consciously or unconsciously, even today, their presence?
Well, I think absolutely. I was introduced to Indian mythology through Amar Chita Katha comic books. So these great graphic novels that had Hanuman and Ram, and so that was the sense of story. And then I really, I think late in high school or early in college, I discovered the poet Hart Crane, a very difficult poet. I didn't understand him at all at the time, but I felt there's some kind of wisdom and secret knowledge and mastery of of craft that I find intoxicating. And again, it was almost like Sanskrit. It was in English, and yet it still had that kind of depth of mystery. And so he was one of the first poets. And I've always been interested in this. We'll talk about Drunken Boat. We have a folio on A.K. Ramanujan, the great Indian poet, Wallace Stevens, certainly. And so these were poets I was reading a lot as a youngster. Now I think Tony and I both would say there are a number, especially contemporary poets, that inspire us all the time. But yes, some of those childhood songs, my mother also used to sing bhajans and Tamil poetry to me while I slept. And so some of those poems as well.
Do you remember some?
Well, I would clear out the studio. I can clear out a karaoke hall. But, things from the Gita Govinda and, I've translated Andal. And so some of her Tirupavai, some of those little verses and songs, all of that, I think, made me connected to language in a very different way. It was no longer utilitarian, but it was something that you could use to create a portal into something far larger.
So now I'd like to know with the Tony, as I asked Ravi Shankar, what sort of poets and writers influenced during your early days? Yes. And like I also mentioned about my personal experience of my dad bringing that sort of books that I still entertain. Mark Twain, I still entertain him because, that early days influence is something you carry on for, I think, for long, over the span of your career. Yeah. So what do you feel? Who are those poets and writers who influenced you the most? And do you also have some kind of influence even today when you are already a professor and you have done 21 plus books and all?
Yes, I mean, the problem is that when you ask that question, it opens the whole world. I'm the son of an immigrant from Greece, and so I was raised surrounded by Greek music, Greek poetry, Greek culture, and so early on I became interested in reading epic poetry, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in that time in the translation of Fitzgerald. But I began, again, because my father was a professor of comparative literature, I was surrounded by the world's literature, and also read A.K. Ramanujan's translation of the Ramayana, and I got picked up the Mahabharata and all of the wonderful bhakti poets that I could find from India. And then I found a wonderful early anthology of Chinese poetry called The White Pony, and I got really excited about Chinese poetry. So world literature and also wonderful poetry from Japan. But then from the States, I got really interested in those poets who were deeply influenced by, you might say, late European and Latin American surrealism. The people like James Wright and Robert Bly, who were reading Cesar Vallejo and Jorge Luis Borges, well, less Borges, but I was interested in Borges, Pablo Neruda, Octavio Paz, Federico Garcia Lorca, Georg Trakl. And so I was reading all these in high school. And American poets, especially like William Carlos Williams. Now, here's the interesting thing, how it ties in today. Finally, after going to college and going then to graduate school and reading William Carlos Williams with pleasure all those years, and then doing my dissertation on William Carlos Williams, and then having a whole career as a writer and a professor, I finally have taken my dissertation on William Carlos Williams. 35 years I worked on it. 35 years. It is finally coming out in the fall. It took, it did. It's not that I'm so slow. It's just that the world had to change enough to tell me what I was writing, because the philosophical thought, hadn't gone far enough for me to be able to articulate what he was doing. He was that far ahead of his time.
So to what extent do you agree with Wordsworth that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of power, powerful feelings, and emotions recollected in tranquility? So is that what Wordsworth said still relevant today?
Yes. I mean, it's the neuroscience talks about it as the way in which we get into the creative flow state when the default network happens in the brain. And the default network is spread across the brain. It's many different parts of the brain. And it's when you're in a slightly depressed state, not in the sense of sad, but like slightly dreamy. And when you're at that point, you can make connections that are far and unexpected. Okay, so at that point, when you have the spontaneous overflow of emotion found in reflection, that's when you're in that dreamy state and it spontaneously comes out of you. That's when you have the eureka moment, when you're not looking for it. So it's very much like the Taoist notion of natural self, right? That if you try hard, if you will yourself to write that poem, you're going to have a hard time writing that poem. But if you if you take a walk, if you sit in the bath, if you go off to sleep thinking about something beautiful, you'll suddenly be like, sit up and say, I have a poem to write, you know. So I would agree with him. I think he's naming something that's at the core of the creative process.
Okay, so exactly same thing I would like to ask Ravi. So what would you like to add on what Wordsworth said? It is still relevant today? That is a powerful flow of emotions. And
I think it could be. I think poetry can be defined in a number of different ways. I like Emily Dickinson's idea that I know a good poem when I feel like my head has been taken off or I feel so cold no fire can ever warm me. Right? So there's an ineffable quality about poetry. Each of us probably values something a little bit different. But I think ultimately it's about cultivating greater awareness to the world around us and to language. We're surrounded by language. We're bombarded by it. Advertisements, newspaper, all kinds of things coming at us. And I think poetry asks us to have a moment of respite, a little bit of quiet, where you can examine both yourself and the world. And if you're lucky, as Tony said, sometimes the oracular will happen and the magic will happen. But other times I've had poems that I've had to work on for years that I haven't quite got right, that I keep turning around and revising something. And then I've occasionally had poems kind of appear fully made like a lightning bolt, and you can't will that. So I think being receptive is probably the key to being able to write poetry.
so now the next question is my personal favorite, since we always say that when a writer writes poems or some kind of essay or some kind of story or even novels, once they write, now it becomes of the readers, not of the writers anymore, So when you write deeply personal poems or deeply personal literature, then at what point it becomes of readers and not yours? And that feels like a loss or a liberation? What exactly does it feels like? And or something you cannot name off, what does it feels like?
That's a really great question because I think you do expose yourself, make yourself completely vulnerable, but it's transmuted in the crucible of art into something else. And I believe, the moment up until I send my poem, it's accepted for publication, it's mine. The moment that it's in the world, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the world, and I'm happy for the world to interpret it as they might, right? I've certainly put in some breadcrumbs. I have my own intention, but sometimes a poem wants to do something other than what you want it to do. There's this Billy Collins poem, How to Read Poetry, and he talks about waving to the author's name on the shore, which I love because it could say hello, or you could be saying goodbye. I'm going to take this poem, I'm going to do what I want with it, which I think is completely fine. So that, to me, the moment of creation is mine, the moment of transmission, perhaps, is the reader's.
Yeah, what Tony would you like to add to this question? So from what point it doesn't feel like it's yours anymore? Now it's about the readers, and does it feels like a loss or the liberation or something that you cannot even name?
If you look at academics talking about that very question, they will tell you different things over the last century. The new critics would tell you, we don't care about the biography of the author. It's just the object itself, the poem itself, that we can look at like a machine and understand how it works by reducing it to its parts. And then later, a reader response theory said, no, it's all in the audience. And then the deconstructionist said, no, it's in the language. And then Foucault says, no, it's all about power working through language. It's power manifesting itself in the poem, and so on and so on and so on. The way I see it is we are like spiders. And spiders, out of the spinnerets in their abdomen, shoot out these webs into the world. And they make this incredibly beautiful pattern. But that pattern is their brain. The brain is not in their skull. The brain is also out in the world. And through the web, they can find mates, they can find prey, they can find places where the web is broken so they can go in to repair it. And so we are all spiders. I mean, this interview will go out on the World Wide Web, right? Right? It's a network. And at that point, all of us will connect to your audience. I think the same thing happens with poets. We think we are like little prisoners inside our skull. No, we are out through this microphone. We are shooting our webs to, into the world to figure out where they will cling. And at all points, we are also beyond the skin of our body and in each other. Poetry, religion often talks about how we are all one. There's a joke. What do you say to the man at the Zen hot dog stand? Make me one with everything. I think poetry, when you think of it as a web, frees you to get past the self. Yeah, my life, my very personal passions and sorrows become you, because at that moment you become me. And so I don't think I give it up. I think we become each other.
Oh, I see. So now, before diving into Nepali poems and Nepali literature and what sort of Nepali literary figures you met and all, so it's a very normal question, but that really gets you to connect with our Nepali audience. So, how's Nepal?
To be honest, my deeper connection is to Indian literature, and I mainly know Nepali literature through the wonderful writers I met 2 years ago at the Himalayan Literature Festival through my friend Yuyutsu Sharma, whom I met in a bookstore in Ohio when I was there with my girlfriend, and she took me to a bookstore because she knew I was a poet. And there I was in the poetry section, and there was this man also in the poetry section. And whenever you meet somebody in the poetry section of a bookstore, you know this is an interesting person. And so we started a conversation and ended up with a good friendship. And so through him and through his literary magazine Pratik, I've become much more involved with this. And this summer, in fact, we are working together on a special issue of the magazine focusing on the ghazal, and we'll have a number of Nepali poets involved in that as well.
Okay, the same question to Ravi. How's Nepal? You've been Nepal quite a few number of times than Tony. So how's Nepal?
I always find Nepal such a welcoming, open place. I love Nepalese food. I had a great thukpa and momos. And every time I come, it seems transformed in some way. It seems kind of cleaner, more vibrant, the youthful energy that I feel. It feels like it's on the precipice of kind of change, and there's a positive energy, which I really like. I first encountered Nepalese literature when one of the poets here is Tina Chang. And Tina Chang and I and a great Palestinian-American poet, Natalie Handal, in 2008, actually, and we began this project actually right after 9/11. All of us were living in New York City, and we felt devastated as New Yorkers, and yet the double devastation we didn't realize we would feel was then all of a sudden the East would be tarred with this brush that I was kind of considered to be a terrorist, or I experienced racism that I hadn't in 20 years, since I'd grown up as a kid. And so all of that was really upsetting, and we thought, the only way we can respond is to show the shared humanness that we have, and we collected together in this book that was published by Norton Language for a New Century, Contemporary Poetry from Asia, the Middle East, and beyond, over 450 poets writing in 40 different languages from 61 different countries, and one of those countries happened to be Nepal. And so we included work from Manjushree Thapa, and we had a number of other poets included, and so that was my first introduction. The first time I was in Nepal, at the invitation of Yutsu Sharma, I taught a workshop, and it was actually, we did a number of ghazals in that workshop, and what I was shocked, and this is maybe about the transformation, most of the workshop participants, and this would be very strange in America, were elderly gentlemen. And there was a certain reverence and respect. I found that when people found out I was a poet, I wasn't greeted with derision and laughter, but in fact with a great deal of respect. Now, actually, the fascinating thing is in the workshop we have now, I noticed that there are many more young women and young people who are invested, and so there seems to be that kind of change. But, the other thing, Nepal has a relaxed attitude, I think, and I sense that, I feel that, and it's one of the few places where you can see a Hindu temple next to a Buddhist stupa, next to another kind of shrine or a mosque, and there seems to be a certain kind of way in which they all get together, harmony, a certain harmony, and I find that really, coming from America, not a lot of harmony, and in India as well, we have such chaos and discord that there's something very refreshing about being here in Nepal.
Okay, so Nepali poet has its own ancient kind of tradition and devotional verse and the nature's, definition of poems and all. So, and we kind of write poems in a way where it's quite personal, more personal touch into poems. Nepali poets usually do like that. So now you have spent time here. Do you feel any difference between what Nepali poets are doing and your own poetic image or your poetic genre? And what do you sense is the deepest or biggest difference between Nepali poets and the poets?
Well, it would be hard for me to generalize, only knowing Nepali poetry kind of briefly, and I've worked in the workshop, but I will say one quality that I've noticed is there's maybe a little more earnestness in Nepali poetry, that there is a way of expressing emotion directly. Many of my students, I think in America, we approach emotion obliquely or encoded in some way. And so there's a certain kind of refreshing authenticity there is, and you mentioned Williams, and I wrote an article for the Academy of American Poets called In Praise of Abstraction, where I actually was arguing for a small Rilke poem over this idea of no ideas but in things. So I think there is a place for abstraction, but if it becomes too abstract, it becomes hard to relate to. So I think that there's also a lot of myth and tradition, kind of a political sensibility and a sense of family that I find in Nepali poetry, but I'm always interested in reading more, and I want to find out more about what the young contemporary Nepalese poets are doing, because I probably imagine it's a whole diverse range of things.
So, Tony, you would like to add something to that?
Just that the devotional poetry tradition is one that deeply influenced me. From around the world, but not. I'm talking about also the Zen tradition in China and Japan, but also the Sufi tradition and the Bhakti tradition, and so on. But I think that, and it directly influenced my poems, but I think my first way into it was through something that's equivalent in the West, which is religious poetry or devotional poetry that blends together the sexual, the erotic, but also the devotional. And so you see this in St. John of the Cross, the great Spanish poet. You see it in Rainer Maria Rilke, extraordinary 20th century poet, German language poet, and what you find there is that that what the religious tradition needs to do is to break down your barriers, right? It needs to break down your resistance to spirituality. And it does this through paradox. It does this through rhetoric. It does this through sometimes humor. But it also does it often by blending together something of the sexual or love joining, metaphorized as joining together with the God or with the oneness of the world. And this is something that you see very much in St. John of the Cross, who sees himself as essentially having sex with Christ as part of joining with God. Or you see this in the biblical Song of Songs. You see this in Rainer Maria Rilke, who is the great love poet, but also the great spiritual poet of the 20th century. My poet explicitly models itself on these as a way of taking the confessional tradition, where you find your pain, you find your grievance, and you push down on the bruise until it becomes grief, and you put that on the page. And that becomes a little bit boring if you're just talking about your own grief, but if you can praise abstraction by praising an abstract God or an abstract oneness, then root it in the body, embody it, then you can have an incredible poetry.
So now what I'd like to ask is, so since you already mentioned about your father, who is also a literary figure, so what I found is your father and you have kind of distinct personalities when it comes to writing,
Yes.
if I'm not wrong. So you personally edit the anthologies of world literatures and also bringing Chinese voices in English. So that's very interesting because you have your own set and you have your own tone in literature. So how is it possible to not be influenced with someone who is a literary figure, and not only literary figure, also I think he was also the finalist in the Pulitzer Award as well. So who is also very influencing a literary figure and also father. So how is it possible to just make your own tone?
I completely hear your question, and it's different than you might think. There's an American literary critic named Harold Bloom, and he has a book called The Anxiety of Influence. You're anxious about being influenced. And so, you know, the great poet for him has to look at the previous great poets who are the father figures or the mother figures, but he's very patriarchal, so for him it's the father figure. And like Oedipus, who meets his father on the road and kills him, you have to essentially kill the father to become your own self. There's a Buddhist saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. You're not supposed to kill the Buddha, but you can't become the Buddha by following the Buddha, right? I have an entirely different approach. Many people had to rebel against their parents to be able to find their creativity. I had to accept my parents because I had to say the life they lived, the artist's life, the bohemian life, the poet life, the life of dancing and singing and openness and freedom, that's the life I want. So for me, I spent my whole life being my father's best friend. And he's been my best friend. And when he writes a poem, he calls me up, I go over it, and vice versa. And we wish each other the best, we help each other. So instead of killing my father, I kiss my father.
I can personally relate to you because since my father was also a writer, so I can personally relate to this. So okay, moving forward, I would like to ask Ravi that let's talk about this gatekeeping culture. What do you think? So Nepali poets writing poems not only in Nepali language but enough in English language. So is there some sort of gatekeeping from the Western side that's not allowing Nepali poets, or not only Nepali poets, in fact, the South Asian poets as a whole, to make the remarkable presence in the Western world from their literature, or they are not capable enough competing with the West? Just be honest.
Well, I would say there is a gatekeeping culture. I don't think it's restricted to Nepal or South Asia. I think it is a kind of endemic problem, in fact. Unfortunately, and I went into literature thinking it was much purer than business or, law. But in fact, I found there's just as much nepotism. There's, this kind of sleaziness can exist. So I think part of the problem is that, in America, very little translated literature is published at all. I think it's less than 3%, according to studies. And so the publishers, when they choose what is published, they oftentimes want a kind of a representative voice, or even sometimes an exoticized voice, someone who represents not the true nature of the society, but one that they can kind of commercialize and sell, a kind of prepackaged version. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it might be a different in aesthetics. I think sometimes maybe Nepali poetry is interested in different kinds of themes and concepts, but the good thing, I think, is that now there are so many publications online, independent publishers, magazines in India. In fact, someone who is interested could just start their own global journal in Nepal. So, I mean, I think you have to be very proactive. I think certainly there is a resistance. Still, I mean, I was told by a very prominent, I won't say who it was, a prominent Latin writer that, Jhumpa Lahiri, Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, there's so many Indian writers are being published. And of course, these are just the figureheads. They're kind of the exception that prove the rule. I know many others who are not being published. And so the only way, I think, is to engage in community, to take part in readings, to send work out, but also to actively engage with the different kind of work that is happening. I think that it's slowly starting to change. I know the magazine I edit, Drunken Boat, we're very interested in global voices, and when we open for submissions again, would love to see work from Nepali writers.
That sounds nice. Okay, now a bit personal question. So since you both write and you both have your own style of writing, so everybody has their own style of writing. So whether they're from the same kind of society, they belong to the same society or different society, but they still have different kind of writing because everyone is unique. Okay, so now, how do you write? It sounds very generic, but the very essence of my question is that some people find the hills and the hill station to go and write a novel. Some find the quiet room with a cup of coffee maybe, or in the library setup, and this sort of places that give some kind of kick to start writing, or the provocation of thoughts that comes around from the places. And so what are your personal choices to start writing? Or you take holidays maybe to some of the places to just write a book, or maybe to write something. So I'd ask both of you the same question, but I'd like to start with Ravi.
Okay. Well, for me, I don't like to, I studied in graduate school with a terrific poet, Lucy Brock-Broido, who's passed away now. And she was a kind of mystical poet in the sense that she believed she'd like to write in a room with velvet curtains and 3 candles and 2 cats only in the months of September to March or something, right? And
That's a strange evening.
she had her own ritual.
Yeah.
For me, I don't like to empower writer's block, and so I like to try to write anywhere. I mean, I could be walking along and I overhear a snippet of conversation, and I will file it away to turn in my head to see how I might facet it. Other times, I'll sit down if I'm at a residency, or those are the only moments I can spend hours working on a poem. I'll write draft after draft until I can arrive at something. I do have a space, in my condo I live in Providence, and my kind of kitchen table office, where many of my poems begin. I like to transcribe things in a notebook. I find the physical act of that, and then when you then bring it into the computer, that's already one act of revision, right? You're already kind of changing and seeing it in a different way. So that's something.
So you don't need hill station or something.
You don't
like
need hill
that.
stations. Well, one thing I do, I think I also like to use generative prompts. So, sometimes, and as a professor, we have many of these, but just starting a page and with a phrase, so-and-so said, right? Someone said something as the first line of the thing you're going to write, and then you just allow the mind. I'm a big believer in free writing, that when you initially are writing, you shouldn't worry about grammar, punctuation. Is this good? Will it be published? No. You want to allow as much of the conscious and unconscious mind to unravel, because ultimately no one has to see it. You're the editor. You can pick and choose, and it might be, you have to be patient also. I know we live in a instantaneous gratification culture. We want it now. But I find, you do something, a free write for 15 minutes a day, you'll inevitably find a couple of little gems in there that you can use to build on and to write. And so that's the other thing, is you do have to, if you want to be a writer, you do have to read and you do have to write. And it takes practice. If you want to be a basketball player, you have to shoot free throws. You can't just go out and think you can start the ball, right? So it does take discipline. I mean, what did they say? 10,000 hours of practice. We talked about mastery today, to become a master in anything, right? So that engaging in that practice, which, as Tony was saying, can be a really a devotional practice. It can be a healing and meditative practice. It can allow you to make sense of the world. I believe poetry can be used as a therapeutic tool to help us process trauma, all of those things. So I think don't delimit yourself. Don't think poetry is only about certain things, about heartbreak or grief. In fact, you can write a poem about anything at all. And so I would say be as open as possible.
So what's your personal preference, Tony? So you also have a kitchen kind of table where you write, or you love hill station? It's not that I want to take you guys to hill station or something that anytime soon, but so what's your personal preference?
I mean, physically, I will write anywhere. I often write at my desk in the dining room, the dining room table, just because that's where I find myself often. But one way I like to write is when I'm commuting to work. I have an hour drive to work. I'll put my phone on the dash and I'll put on the voice memo, and I'll just start talking. And I find that when you talk a poem, then it's a lot more natural than when you're using the rational, conscious brain to write it through will. It comes out in a way that feels more human. So, and often I'll then go like Ravi and transcribe that through the revision process. But I'll tell you this: my very first creative writing workshop, when I was 15 years old, and I was a big fan of fantasy and science fiction. And the great fantasy and science fiction writer Roger Zelazny had come to a writers' conference at Indiana University, where my father was teaching, and he got me into the workshop. And I was very, very shy, surrounded by these writers who were going to become very famous. One of them was George R.R. Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones and so on, and for whom, Zelazny was his great master. And the one question I asked during the workshop was, what do you do about writer's block? And he says, I put a piece of paper in the typewriter and I begin typing. And once you start typing, after a while, you find you have something to say. And so I've kind of taken that as a bit of my mantra as well. Instead of saying I don't know what to write, I start writing. And then if I can't write the poem today, I'll work on the story. If I can't write the story, I'll work on the anthology. If I can't work on the anthology, I'll work on the translation. If I can't work on the translation, I'll work on the textbook or the song or the opera, or maybe I'll make a drawing. The point is, you can always do something. You can always do something, and you need to be doing enough things that you can figure out what you can do. So I'll say none of my books have ever come out quickly. I'd say on average, it takes me 8 to 12 years to write a book. But many of them are 20 years, or the newest one, 35 years, right? I don't have that many lifetimes, so I don't know how many times I can do that. But maybe I'll get reborn and I can do it again. So I don't know. My point is, I don't write one book for 35 years. I write usually 14 or 15 books at once. And I write what I can write. And so that's my advice. Oh, I will say one more thing about gatekeeping. Right? Okay. I think of myself, I'm probably a gatekeeper, but I think of myself more as a gate opener. I spend a lot of my books are anthologies of world literature, or anthologies that incorporate world literature, or translations of world literature that try to bring the world to the English language audience so that we can thrill to it, and we can change what we write, because we love that we're hearing Odo no Kamachi, this Heian woman poet, speaking of the incredible pain of her life in such a way that it feels like she's sitting across from you today, 1,000 years later, and we feel her, right? The war, not just feel her across time, but across space, across language, and so I feel that going back to the thing that Ravi said, you read to write. But if you only read your contemporaries, you're going to be a boring writer. I'm sorry. Read the world, and you'll be the world.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, so now thank you for sharing all of this wonderful experience, and not only your experience, but your personal choices, and from the gatekeeping to your span of your career and how you chose this. So now we are coming to end of our conversation, but I have one last question for both of you. So since you are in Nepal now, what are you taking back from Nepal? And what did you give to all these Nepali people from your workshop? How is this going? And what do you give to Nepali people while you were here? And how do you want Nepalese to grow? So as a whole, it's a Nepali question.
Well, I have an idea. I hate to say it on TV because I haven't made it happen yet. But I was teaching at the Kathmandu International School. And the students at first were very shy. But when they started writing, I asked them to write one poem. We wrote 3 poems. I asked them to write a poem. I said, we wrote a poem, but we want to sing it to you. There was, yeah, it's fantastic. It was incredible. And then afterwards, one of the students came up to me and says, is there some sort of contest that I could send my poetry to? And so it struck me that, well, maybe we could work with some Nepali magazine or people to create a contest for school children so that the next generation can grow up thinking, well, I'll get married, I'll have a job, I'll do something, but maybe I'll also be thrilled about writing a poem or writing 3 poems and then singing them. And maybe someone will say yes to me. So that's what I hope maybe I'll try to make happen. But I also say that for me, when I come to Nepal, I think of who I was at age 24 when I first came here and who I am at age 65, 41 years. And time is the essential mystery. So I think what I take back from here is mystery.
What do you take back from Nepal, and what do you give to Nepalese, and what would you like to say to all these Nepalese people and Nepal as a whole?
Well, I have to say, primarily and fundamentally, I take the warmth of the Nepalese people and the friendships I have with people like Ken and speaking to you today, all of the wonderful Nepali writers that we're going to meet at HLF. Those voices, and actually the young, we've been working with this organization, the Prodigy Project. I've been deeply impressed with both their kind of enthusiasm, their energy. I'm trying to give back a little bit in terms of my knowledge about the writing world, about craft, but I'm taking from them so much vitality and vigor and this idea that society can in fact be reshaped. It's kind of a difficult moment. In America, it's easy to feel despondent and hopeless. And I think I'm taking a lot of hope, actually, from encountering these young Nepalese people. Last time I was here, I did take back a lot of handicrafts, beautiful rugs and little Buddhas and stuff. Probably this time I will take something much more durable and substantial, which is this love of this country and the people, and the idea that, and I think people outside of Nepal should know that it's much more than the mountains. The mountains are one part of the glory of the country, but in fact it's really in the hearts of the everyday people that you find the true treasure, and that's the thing that I'll bring back with me.
So thank you very much for being with us, Tony and Ravi, both of you. And we talked about poems, literatures, and Nepal, and when you were here while you were 24, Annapurna Circuit, and the monkeys off the record, we talked about monkeys and all. So thank you for taking out your valuable time and talking with us. We are very grateful for your time. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. A pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We had Tony Barnstone and Ravi Shankar. So thank you for watching Deshsanchar.